Dorset, September 1819. The letter had arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Mrs. Allen Ashworth preferred for delivering information that would rearrange someone's life, because Wednesday allowed 2 full days of recovery before the social obligations of the weekend. The letter was addressed to Corwin Gavel, shipping merchant, Manchester, and it contained, in the precise handwriting of a woman who had been managing aristocratic affairs for 30 years, a proposal that was not a proposal, an invitation that was not an invitation, and an opportunity that Mrs. Ashworth had decided was going to happen whether anyone involved agreed to it or not. The Duke of Caverley required a wife. He had been requiring one, by Mrs. Ashworth's estimation, for approximately 4 years, which was the length of time since the previous Duchess had died of a fever that had taken her in 11 days and taken everything recognizable out of the Duke in considerably fewer. He had not in 4 years made any effort to address the requirement. Mrs. Ashworth, who was his late wife's closest friend, and the only person in Dorset who could tell the Duke of Caverley what to do and survive the experience, had decided the matter could no longer wait. The Gavel family had a daughter. She was 23. She had her father's head for numbers and her late mother's composure, and a fortune in shipping that was substantial enough to interest a duke and recent enough to irritate one. She was, Mrs. Ashworth had noted during a London dinner the previous spring, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke and saw more than she mentioned, and who managed a room the way a good captain managed a quarterdeck, with complete awareness and no wasted movement. Eloine Gavel arrived at Caverley Hall on the 2nd Tuesday of September, accompanied by her father, a traveling case of correspondence she intended to work through during the visit, and the settled focus of a woman who had been told she was being considered for a position and had decided to conduct her own interview simultaneously. She saw the house first from the Ridge Road, all at once and from above, the full weight of it visible before you were close enough to be diminished by it. It was enormous, not in the way of houses that had been added to over centuries, but in the way of a house that had been conceived as a statement and built as a fact. It sat in the Dorset Valley like something that had always been there. Alain looked at it and thought about what a house like this cost to maintain, and what it cost to let slip, and what it told you about a man who had reportedly let considerable portions of both his life and his estate slip simultaneously for 4 years. She wore a dress the color of winter sea, dark blue with gray in it, the kind of fabric that moved well and cost precisely what it appeared to cost, and did not apologize for the expense. She had her father's latest shipping reports in her case, and her mother's pearl ring on her right hand, and the settled quality of a woman who had buried her mother at 19 and had spent the 4 years since becoming the person her father needed her to be, and finding, to her moderate surprise, that she was suited to it. The carriage pulled into the Caverley Drive. Mrs. Ashworth met them at the entrance with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting and did not intend to waste the momentum. She looked at Eloine with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who had been selecting people for rooms for 3 decades and appeared satisfied, which she communicated by saying nothing at all and leading them inside. The Duke kept them waiting for 20 minutes, which Eloine noted without surprise. She had been kept waiting by men who wished to establish precedents before, and she had developed the practice of using the time productively, which meant she spent the 20 minutes reading the room. It was a morning room, south-facing, with light that would have been generous if anyone had maintained the windows. The curtains were heavy and slightly faded, and pulled 3/4 closed. The furniture was excellent, and 10 years past its best arrangement. There were flowers on the side table, but they had the quality of flowers placed by staff rather than chosen by anyone who lived here, technically correct and without warmth. She looked at the mantelpiece. There was a small watercolor in a silver frame, turned slightly away from the room, as though someone had moved it to face the wall and then thought better of it, and compromised on an angle that made it visible only from the chair nearest the fireplace. She could not see the subject from where she sat, but she noted the frame and the angle and the fact that only one chair had a clear line of sight to it. He arrived at 10:30. He came through the door with the energy of a man who had been interrupted from something he considered more important, a man who had stopped making adjustments for other people's expectations. He was tall. She had been told he was tall, but the information had not prepared her for the way the room reorganized itself around him when he entered. He was 46. She had expected the age to be visible in the way age was visible on men who had lived indoors. It was not visible in that way. It was visible in the lines beside his eyes and in the quality of his hands, which were not the hands of a man who had spent 46 years being served. She noticed his hands immediately. They were the first thing about him that did not match what she had been told. His hands were large and careful and marked across the knuckles with the roughness of someone who worked with soil, with tools, with living things. The hands of a man who made something grow. She noted this and set it beside the faded curtains and the turned watercolor and the flowers placed by staff, and began to assemble a picture that was not the one Mrs. Ashworth had described. "Miss Gavel," he said, "Your Grace." Her father and Mrs. Ashworth had arranged themselves near the door with the studied casualness of two people who wished to be present and invisible simultaneously, and were achieving neither. The Duke looked at them and then at Elowen and said, "I prefer to speak directly. Shall we?" They were taken to his study, not the library, not the drawing room, the study, which was the room where he actually worked, and this told her something he had not intended to communicate, that he had categorized this meeting as business and had put her in the room where he conducted it. The study was different from the morning room. It was alive. Papers on the desk in organized disorder, estate maps on the wall, 2 books open face down on separate surfaces, and on the windowsill behind the desk, in a cracked clay pot that belonged in a greenhouse and not in a ducal study, a plant she recognized as a Dorset orchid, the kind that required daily attention and particular light, and a patience that most people did not associate with dukes. He sat behind the desk. She sat across from it. He looked at her with the direct, exhausted attention of a man who was doing something he did not want to do and intended to complete it as efficiently as possible. "I will be straightforward with you," he said, "because I do not have the energy for the alternative, and because Mrs. Ashworth has already invested considerable effort in arranging this meeting, and the least I owe her is honesty about what I am offering." "Please," she said. "I require a wife," he said. "The estate requires an heir, and the county requires a duchess, and both of these requirements have been explained to me with increasing frequency by people I cannot afford to ignore." He paused. "I am not offering a courtship, Miss Gavel. I am not offering companionship. I am offering a position in a household that functions well enough, and a title that carries weight in this county, and a life that will be comfortable and appropriate, and entirely." He stopped. The word he did not say occupied the room. She heard it as clearly as if he had spoken it. "Entirely without expectation of closeness," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his expression, the brief, unguarded recognition of a man who had been understood before he was ready to be. "I have already had a marriage," he said. "I do not have another one in me. What I had with Nella was—" He stopped again. He looked at the orchid on the windowsill. His hand, the one resting on the desk, moved a 1/4 inch toward it, and then stopped. "What I had with Nella was the whole of it. I have been informed that this is not a practical position, but it is an honest one, and I would rather you understood it now than discovered it after." She looked at his hand, the one that had moved toward the orchid. She looked at the cracked clay pot and the daily attention it implied, the study full of work and books and maps, the living evidence of a man who had not stopped caring about things, who had simply stopped being able to say so. She thought about what it meant to sit across a desk from a man who was telling her he had nothing left, while everything in the room contradicted him. She thought about the watercolor on the mantelpiece, turned at an angle that allowed one chair to see it. She thought about the word gentle, and how it lived in the things he did when he believed no one was keeping an inventory. She stood. He looked up, not surprised exactly, but with the quality of a man who had expected this outcome and had prepared himself for it, and was finding that the preparation did not make it simpler. She reached across the desk. She placed her hand, briefly and with complete deliberation, on top of his, the one that had moved toward the orchid and stopped. His hand was warm. It was rough across the knuckles. It did not pull away. "You are mistaken, Your Grace," she said quietly, "about what you have left." Then she lifted her hand and left the study and collected her father from the morning room and was in the carriage before Mrs. Ashworth had fully registered that the interview was over. The Dorset Road unrolled beneath the carriage wheels in the late September light, and her father, who had spent 23 years learning when to speak and when to let his daughter arrive at language on her own, said nothing until they were past the Caverly gates and onto the public road. "Well," he said. "He is not what they described," she said. Her father waited. They said he was cold. Mrs. Ashworth said he had become unreachable. The county calls him the Stone Duke, and I have heard that phrase 4 times since we arrived in Dorset, always delivered with the confidence of people who believe a name they have given someone is the same as knowing him. She looked out the window at the Dorset hills moving past, green and gold in the September afternoon. "He is not cold," she said. "He is grieving, and he has been grieving for 4 years, without anyone noticing the difference, because the difference requires you to look at what a man does with his hands when he thinks the interview is about his words." Her father looked at her. "What does he do with his hands?" "He grows orchids," she said, "in a cracked pot on his study windowsill. A Dorset orchid, the kind that needs watering every morning and particular light. And the pot is cracked, which means he has had it long enough to break it and has chosen to keep it rather than replace it." She paused, and there is a watercolor on the morning room mantelpiece, turned so that only one chair can see it. His chair. He has arranged the room so that he can look at her when no one else is looking at him. Her father was quiet for a moment. "You learned all of this in 20 minutes of waiting and 10 minutes of conversation. I learned all of this because everyone else in that county has spent 4 years listening to what he says, and not one of them has looked at what he does." The carriage moved through the Dorset countryside. She thought about a man who had sat behind a desk and told her he had nothing to offer, and had not noticed that his hand moved toward a living thing the moment he said his dead wife's name. "What will you do?" her father asked. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the road ahead, where it curved south toward the coast, toward the harbor town of Bridmore, where her father's shipping company maintained a regional office that she had been managing by correspondence for 2 years. "The Bridmore office needs direct oversight," she said. "The harbor expansion alone requires someone on the ground, and the coastal freight contracts need renegotiating before the winter routes open." Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who had raised a daughter who could make any decision sound like commerce. "The Bridmore office," he said. 20 minutes from Caverly Hall. "It is a sound business decision, Father." "You touched his hand," he said. She looked at him. "I saw it through the door," he said, "before Mrs. Ashworth managed to close it. You touched his hand and said something to him, and his face did a thing I have not seen on a man's face in some considerable time. I told him he was mistaken about what he had left. And are you certain he is?" She thought about the orchid. She thought about the watercolor. She thought about his hand, warm and rough and still beneath hers, and the fact that he had not pulled away. "Yes," she said, "I am certain." Her father nodded. He opened his case and took out the Manchester shipping reports and began reviewing them, which was his way of saying that the conversation was finished and the decision was hers, and he would be present for whatever came of it. Alawan looked out the window at the Dorset coast, becoming visible in the distance, the line of sea and sky that she was about to make the center of her daily life, for reasons that were approximately 40% commercial and entirely, completely, not at all, about a man with rough hands and a cracked pot, and a grief he had mistaken for emptiness. She almost believed that. For about 3 days, the Bridmore shipping office occupied the first floor of a stone building on the harbor front, with a view of the water and the loading docks and the organized chaos of a working port. Alawan arrived on the 1st of October with 2 trunks, a ledger case, a housekeeper she had brought from Manchester named Mrs. Tarling, who had opinions about coastal air and expressed them frequently, and the focused energy of a woman beginning something she intended to finish. She had taken a lease on the house above the office, which was practical because it meant she could work at any hour, and inconvenient because it meant the smell of salt and tar and fish came through the windows at 5 every morning with the tide, and Mrs. Tarling's opinions intensified accordingly. Dorset noticed. The harbor master mentioned it to the county surveyor. His wife mentioned it to Mrs. Ashworth, who received it with the composure of a woman whose Wednesday letter had produced results ahead of schedule. Alawan spent the first 2 weeks learning the harbor business from the ground, walking the docks every morning, talking to the captains and the warehouse foremen and the customs clerks. She renegotiated 3 contracts in the first week that had been negotiated by men who assumed a Manchester office would never send anyone to check, which caused some irritation among the local merchants and considerable respect among the dock workers. She did not see the Duke for 18 days. On the 19th day, she was on the harbor wall reviewing the expansion plans with the harbor master when she saw him. He was at the far end of the dock, not in a carriage, not on horseback, but on foot, in a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, talking to a fisherman whose boat was beached for repairs. She watched him crouch beside the hull and run his hand along the damaged planking with the attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. She watched him say something to the fisherman that made the man laugh, which was a sound she suspected the county would not have associated with the Stone Duke. He saw her. He straightened and looked at her across the length of the harbor with the expression she recognized from the study, the direct attention, but with something else in it. Now. Surprise, possibly, or the recalibration of a man discovering that a variable he had dismissed had reappeared in a form he had not anticipated. He walked toward her. She did not walk toward him. She waited at the harbor wall with the plans in her hand and the harbor master beside her and the calm certainty of a woman who was on her own ground and knew it. "Miss Gavel," he said. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Ashworth mentioned you had taken the Bridmore office." He looked at the harbor, at the plans in her hand, at the expansion markers driven into the sea wall. She did not mention the scope. "The scope is considerable," she said. "The harbor requires deepening for the larger vessels, and the warehouse capacity is insufficient for the winter trade volume." He looked at the plans. She showed them to him because the expansion required access to the coastal road that ran across his estate land. "The coastal road," he said, pointing to the survey line. He had seen it before she mentioned it. "Yes," she said. "The construction traffic will require widening at the Caverly Bend. I was preparing a formal request to your estate office." He looked at her. "You are telling me this at the harbor wall, rather than sending the formal request." "I'm telling you this at the harbor wall because you are standing at the harbor wall," she said. "The formal request will follow." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The neighboring territory of a smile. The region that a smile might occupy if it were given permission. "Send it to me directly," he said. "Not the estate office." She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the harbor plans and asked 2 more questions about the expansion that were precise and informed, and not the questions of a man making conversation. Then he left. He walked back down the dock toward the beached fishing boat, and she watched him go. And she thought about the almost smile and the words, "Send it to me directly," and the fact that he had been crouching beside a fisherman's damaged hull with his hands on the wood, as though the condition of one small boat in a harbor full of boats was a matter that concerned him personally. She thought, "He is not the Stone Duke." She thought, "He has never been the Stone Duke." She thought, "The entire county has been looking at the wrong thing for 4 years." She turned back to the harbor plans and did not think about any of it further for the rest of the morning, with her usual moderate success. November brought the storm. It came from the southwest on a Thursday night, with the violence that the Dorset coast produced 2 or 3 times a decade, the kind of storm that rearranged the coastline and reminded everyone who lived near it that the sea was not a backdrop, but a participant. The harbor wall held. The warehouses held. The coastal road did not. A section of the Caverly Bend, precisely the stretch that the harbor expansion would have required widening, collapsed into the sea overnight, taking with it 40 feet of road surface, 2 boundary walls, and the only practical route between Bridmore and the 3 Caverly tenant farms that depended on the harbor for their market access. Alawan was at the site by 7 the following morning. She had walked from the office in the November dark, because the road was impassable to carriages, and had arrived at the collapsed section with her surveyor and a lantern and the focused urgency of a woman whose shipping schedule had just been disrupted by geology. The Duke was already there. He was standing at the edge of the collapse in the gray November light, with his estate steward Fawcett and 2 tenant farmers, looking at the damage with the expression she had been learning to read, the one that was not coldness, but calculation. He saw her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "The coastal road is the only access for the Tremaine and Bassett farms." "I know," she said, "and for the harbor warehouse district." "Then we have the same problem." "We have the same problem," she agreed. They stood at the edge of the collapsed road and looked at it together, and what followed was 6 days of work that Elowen would later identify as the period during which she stopped pretending that her interest in the Duke of Caverly was commercial. The repair required coordination. Her shipping contacts could supply the stone and timber faster than any local quarry. His estate labor could provide the men. The engineering required her surveyor's expertise and his steward's knowledge of the drainage patterns. Neither could manage it alone. Both could manage it together, which neither of them commented on, and both understood completely. They met every morning at the site. He arrived first, always, which she learned on the second day when she came at 6:30, and found him already there, studying the drainage plan her surveyor had drawn, with the lantern balanced on a stone, and his hands, gloveless in November, tracing the water channels on the paper with the careful attention she had first seen directed at an orchid. She watched his hands on the survey map. She watched him roll a loose stone between his fingers while listening to Fawcett describe the subsoil. She watched him on the 4th morning kneel in the mud beside a section of collapsed wall and fit 2 fallen stones back into alignment with the patience of a man who understood how things were built and how they came apart. "You have done this before," she said. He looked up at her from the mud, slightly surprised, as though he had forgotten she was watching. "The east wall at Caverly collapsed in the winter of 1812, he said. "Nella and I rebuilt it ourselves. She handed me the stones." He paused. He looked at the wall. She had a theory about the correct order. She was usually right about the correct order of things. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife's name to her since the study. He said it without the guarded quality of September, without the careful framing of a man managing a wound. He said it the way you say the name of someone who is part of the landscape you are standing in, present in the stones and the soil and the work of your hands. Ilawan handed him a stone. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it and fitted it into the wall and said nothing. And the morning continued, and she understood that something had shifted in the space between a cracked orchid pot and a collapsed seawall, and she was not going to examine it yet, because examining it would require her to admit that her moderate success at not thinking about him had deteriorated into no success at all. On the 6th day, the road was passable, not finished, but functional. They stood at the Caverly Bend in the late November afternoon and looked at the work together. The new stone pale against the old, the drainage channels cut and functioning. Your surveyor's drainage design is superior to the original, he said. It should hold for 30 years if the maintenance is kept up. I will see that it is. She looked at him. His hands were at his sides, rough and mudded from the morning's work, and she thought about the county calling him the Stone Duke, and about stones, and what you could build with them if you understood the correct order. Thank you, she said, for the labor and the access. The harbor authority will reimburse the estate for the materials. He looked at her. The road serves my tenants. The reimbursement is unnecessary. The reimbursement is correct procedure. Then send the paperwork, he said. He paused. To me directly. She looked at him. It was the second time he had said it. She was keeping count. I will, she said. He turned and walked back along the coastal road toward Caverly, and she stood at the bend and watched him go and thought. 2. He has said it twice. She thought, I am keeping count, and this is not the behavior of a woman conducting a commercial operation. She walked back to Bridmore in the November dusk and drafted the reimbursement letter and revised it twice, not because the figures required revision, but because the closing line for a letter to a man who had rebuilt a wall with his bare hands and said his dead wife's name like a familiar stone was not something she could locate on the first attempt. December in Dorset was the county turning inward, the same families in the same drawing rooms conducting the same conversations with the practiced efficiency of generations of repetition. The dinners mattered. Who was invited, where they were seated, what was said and overheard. All of it carried weight that outsiders consistently underestimated, and insiders never forgot. Ilawan had been received into the winter circuit with cautious warmth. She was wealthy enough to be included, capable enough to be interesting, and, several hostesses had noted, surprisingly good company. She had also, the county had noticed, been seen with the Duke on 4 separate occasions in connection with the harbor road repair, which was either a practical matter between neighboring interests or a development of considerable significance, depending on who was interpreting it. The December dinner at Colborne House was the largest gathering of the winter season. 35 guests, the full county, hosted by Sir Martin and Lady Colborne, with the hospitality of a family that considered it both a duty and a performance. Ilawan arrived in the winter sea dress, the dark blue, because it was correct, and because Dorset appreciated consistency in a newcomer. She was seated between the Reverend Alcott, who was kind and slightly deaf, and Lady Southern, a visiting baronet's widow she had not previously met. The Duke was 4 seats away, on the opposite side, managing his section of the table with the practiced attention of a man who did it well, despite giving every appearance of finding it unnecessary. Sir Reland Holt was at the far end of the table. She had met him twice before and had catalogued him with comprehensive attention. He was 58, landed, and possessed of the confidence of a man who had never been required to revise an opinion. He had been a friend of the previous Duchess, and had, Mrs. Ashworth told her, appointed himself the guardian of Nella's memory with the zeal of a man who had loved her from a distance and converted the love, upon her death, into a jurisdiction. The conversation turned to the harbor road repair. "The road is holding well," Sir Martin said from the head of the table, addressing the Duke. "Remarkable work for such a short timeline." "Miss Gavel's surveyor designed the drainage," the Duke said. "The engineering was sound." Sir Reland looked up from his plate. He had been waiting for the Duke to mention her name. "Miss Gavel," Sir Reland said, with the tone of a man being charming in a direction that had a destination. "We hear a great deal about Miss Gavel these days. The harbor, the contracts, the road." He smiled at the table. "Such energy. Such commitment to a county she is known for, 3 months? 2.5, Allowance said. 2.5 months. And already so embedded in local affairs, so close to local interests." The pause was calculated. The word close did its work. 4 people at the table heard the implication. Allewin was certain of the number, because she counted the faces that shifted. "One does wonder," Sir Reland continued, "what draws a young woman of 23 from Manchester to a Dorset harbor town with such urgency. The shipping business, of course." He said it twice, the repetition designed to communicate that he did not believe it once. He looked at the Duke, who was holding his wineglass and had not moved. One hopes the commercial motivations are proportionate to the commercial opportunity. And not, he paused, disproportionate to something else entirely. The room heard it. Sir Reland was saying, with the practiced cruelty of a man who believed he was protecting something sacred, that she was an opportunist and a fortune hunter. Allowin held her composure. She had heard this variety of attack before, in Manchester boardrooms and London drawing rooms. She was formulating her response when the Duke spoke. "The harbor road repair," the Duke said, and his voice was not the dinner party voice, not the estate management voice. It was lower and quieter, and carried the weight of a man who had owned this county's attention for 24 years and had never needed to raise his volume to command it. Saved the Tremaine and Bassett farms from a winter without market access. The drainage redesign Miss Gavel's surveyor engineered has resolved a structural weakness in that section of Coast Road that predates my tenure on the estate. He looked at Sir Reland. He did not blink. Miss Gavel's shipping operation has brought 11 new contracts to Bridmore Harbor since October, which represents the single largest increase in commercial activity this port has seen in a decade. The coastal road, the harbor expansion, and the warehouse improvements she has initiated are matters of public record and economic fact. He set down his wineglass. If anyone at this table has questions about the commercial proportionality of Miss Gavel's presence in Dorset, I am happy to provide the figures. I have reviewed them. The silence that followed had the quality of a room recalibrating. "Of course," Sir Reland said. "I merely." "The county," the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not require volume or repetition because the authority was structural and permanent and did not need decoration. "Benefits from people who invest in it seriously. I believe we are all in agreement on that point." He returned to his wine. The conversation resumed, as though nothing had occurred, because in Dorset society, the most significant interventions were the ones that required the room to pretend they had not happened. Allowance sat in the aftermath and did not look at the Duke. She thought about what had just happened with the precision she brought to important information. She thought, he reviewed the figures. She thought, he knows the number of contracts. She thought, he has been paying attention to what I have been building, and he has been paying the kind of attention that involves numbers and facts and the specific evidence of a man who does not pay attention casually. Mrs. Ashworth found her in the drawing room after dinner, materializing at her elbow with practiced timing. "Sir Reland will be careful for the remainder of the season," Mrs. Ashworth said. He implied I was a fortune hunter. He implied several things. None of them survived contact with the Duke's accounting. Elowen looked across the room at the Duke, who was in conversation with Sir Martin and was not looking at her. He knew the figures, Elowen said, the contracts, the harbor numbers. He did not learn those tonight. No, Mrs. Ashworth said. He did not. How long has he been paying attention? Mrs. Ashworth accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman with the composure of a woman who had been waiting to deliver this information. Since October, she said. Since approximately the 19th of October, which was, if I am not mistaken, the day he walked to Bridmore Harbor to look at a fisherman's boat and discovered you on the harbor wall with expansion plans. Elowen looked at her. He has not reviewed the figures for a commercial operation outside his own estate in 4 years, Mrs. Ashworth said. He has not voluntarily attended a dinner in 3. He came tonight because Sir Martin mentioned you would be here, and he did not want you in the room with Reland Holt without. She paused. Without someone who had done the accounting. Elowen held her glass and looked across the room at the Duke, who was still not looking at her, and who had just defended her with numbers and facts and the quiet weight of a man who could have said nothing and chose not to. And she thought, you are not empty at all. You are full of things you have forgotten how to say. She did not speak to him for the rest of the evening. Neither of them crossed the room. But when she left, she passed his chair, and she paused, and she placed her hand on the back of it. Briefly, 2 seconds at most. Not on his shoulder, not on his arm, on the chair, where his hand had been resting a moment before. He looked at the place where her hand had been after she removed it. She saw him look. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He came to Bridmore on a Wednesday morning, 5 days after the Colborne dinner, which was long enough to have thought about it, and short enough to mean the thinking had produced a decision. He came on foot, which she learned later was because his horse had thrown a shoe at the Caverley gate, and he had continued walking rather than wait for the farrier, which told her everything she needed to know about the urgency he would not have described as urgency. She was in the office above the harbor when Mrs. Tarling appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had opinions about unexpected visitors and was, for once, keeping them to herself. "The Duke of Caverley is downstairs," Mrs. Tarling said. Elowen set down her pen. She looked at the harbor through the window. "Show him up," she said. He came into her office with the quality that reorganized the space around him. But something was different. He was standing in a mudded coat, with the look of a man who had walked 4 miles to say something and had not yet arranged the words. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Gavel." He looked at the freight schedules on the desk and the harbor charts on the wall and the 3 ledgers opened simultaneously. "You work here," he said, "every morning. It suits you, better than drawing rooms." "Most things suit me better than drawing rooms." He almost smiled, the neighboring territory again. Then the almost smile faded, and what replaced it was something she had not seen, the expression of a man who had arrived at the edge of something difficult and was not going to retreat from it. "I owe you a correction," he said. "Not an apology, a correction. Apologies are for behavior. This is about something I said that was wrong, and I would like to say the right version." She waited. "In September," he said, "in the study. I told you I had already had a marriage, and did not have another one in me. I told you what I had with Nella was the whole of it. I remember. I was wrong." He said it with the directness she had first seen in the study, but without the exhaustion. This was a man who had examined his own accounting and found an error, and was not going to let it stand. "I believed it when I said it, but I was wrong, and I have known I was wrong since approximately the 19th of October, when I found you on the sea wall with expansion plans and the expression of a woman who was building something. And I realized that I had been describing myself as empty for 4 years, and had not once considered the possibility that I was merely unoccupied. She thought about the word unoccupied, and what it meant when a man who had been calling himself empty discovered the difference. Empty and unoccupied are not the same thing, she said. No, he said. They are not. I required someone to make the distinction visible. He looked at the harbor through the window. You made it visible. In September, in the study, when you put your hand on mine and told me I was mistaken about what I had left. He looked at her. I have been thinking about that for 3 months, about your hand, about what it meant that you touched a man who had just told you he had nothing to offer, and said, "You are mistaken." About what kind of woman does that? The kind who looks at hands rather than speeches, she said. Yes, he said. That kind. The office was quiet. The harbor sounds came through the window, gulls and rope and the creak of boats at their moorings. I came to Dorset because of you, she said. He was still, not entirely. The shipping office needed oversight and the harbor expansion was genuine. But I came knowing you were 4 miles up the coastal road, and I told myself it was commerce, and my father looked at me with the expression he has when he is allowing me to be wrong at my own pace. She looked at the freight schedules on the desk. I wanted you to see me, not the fortune and the father and the 23 years. I wanted you to see what you would not let yourself see in September. I see it, he said. I have seen it since October. Then why did it take until December for you to say so? He looked at the floor, which was the only time she had ever seen him look away from something difficult. Because saying it means Nella is not the whole of it, he said. And I have been living inside that sentence for 4 years, and leaving it feels like leaving her. She stood. She came around the desk and stood in front of him, close enough that she could see the lines beside his eyes, and the roughness across his knuckles, and the stillness of a man at the edge of something he wanted and was afraid to reach for. She could have touched him. She could have put her hand on his arm, on his chest, on the place where the held breath lived. She did not. She put her hands at her sides and looked up at him and said, Nella is not the whole of it. She is the first part of it. And the first part of a life is not diminished by the existence of a second. Something broke in his expression, not dramatically, quietly, the way a held breath releases, the way a man who has been standing very still for a very long time allows himself to move. Elowen, he said. Her name. He had never used it. It had been Miss Gavel for 3 months, across harbors, and dinner tables, and collapsed roads, and a December evening where his hand had rested on a chair she later touched, and now her name was in his voice, and it sounded like the first true thing he had said since Nella died. Hadwin, she said. She took his hand. Not the way she had taken it in September, briefly and diagnostically. She took it the way you take something you intend to keep. Both hands around his one, the rough knuckles and the warmth of a man who grew things in cracked pots and rebuilt walls in the mud and carried 4 years of grief in his hands because his hands were where he kept everything that was real. He looked at their hands. He looked at her. You are 23, he said. I am aware of my age. I am 46. I am aware of your age as well. I've been aware of it since Mrs. Ashworth's letter, and it has not once been the most interesting thing about you. The almost smile crossed his face. This time it arrived. This time it stayed. It was a small, private, unmanaged smile, and it changed his face completely. And she thought, there you are. There is the man in the cracked pot and the turned watercolor. There is the man no one else has seen. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 3 months accumulating evidence and had arrived at a conclusion and was not interested in half measures. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and freight schedules and every decision she had ever been certain about, and nothing about the morning required any further calculation. When they separated, she kept his hand. "The county is going to have opinions," she said. "The county always has opinions. They will say, 'I pursued you.'" "You did pursue me," he said. "You relocated an entire shipping operation to a harbor town 20 minutes from my house, and rebuilt my coastal road, and attended every dinner I attended, and touched my chair when you thought I was not looking." "You were looking." "I was looking," he agreed. "I have been looking since September. I simply didn't know what I was seeing until I walked 4 miles in the mud this morning, because waiting for the farrier felt like more time than I was willing to waste." She looked at him. "That is not a proposal." "That is a preliminary statement," he said, "preceding a proposal. I find it useful to establish terms before formal agreements." "As do I," she said. "My preliminary terms are that you never again describe yourself as empty in my presence, and that the orchid on your windowsill receives a proper pot." "The pot was Nella's," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then the pot stays." He looked at her with the expression that had nothing of the stone duke in it, nothing of September, nothing of a man who had organized grief into policy. Just him, standing in a shipping office above a harbor, holding the hand of a woman who had seen what no one else had looked for. "The pot stays," he agreed. "Everything else is negotiable." They were engaged by the end of January, which was fast by county standards, and slow by Eloin's, who had been ready to formalize the arrangement since approximately the Wednesday morning in her office, and had been exercising a patience she did not naturally possess, while Hadwin conducted what he described as due diligence, and what she described as stalling. The proposal happened in the greenhouse, not the drawing room, not the library, not any of the rooms at Caverly Hall that were designed for occasions. The greenhouse, which was where he kept the orchids, a long glass structure on the south side of the house that Eloin had not seen until January, because he had not shown it to anyone since Nella, and the fact that he showed it to her was the proposal before the proposal. There were 37 orchids. She counted them while he stood at the door, and watched her count them with the expression of a man who had just let someone into the room he had been living in for 4 years, and was waiting to see what she did with the information. She touched the petals of the nearest one, a pale winter bloom in a pot that wasn't cracked. She looked at him. "Nella started them," he said. "I continued them." He paused. "That is, I think, the most honest thing I can tell you about what I'm offering." "You are offering a continuation," she said. "I am offering a beginning," he said, "that honors what came before it." He looked at the orchids. "I am asking you to marry me, Eloin, not because the estate requires it, or the county expects it, or Mrs. Ashworth has arranged it, because the greenhouse has been the only room in this house where I have been myself for 4 years, and you are the first person I have wanted to bring into it." She looked at the glass walls and the winter light coming through them, and the careful, daily attention visible in every leaf and every stem. "Yes," she said. He crossed the greenhouse. He took her hands, both of them, with the grip she now knew, firm and rough and deliberate. "Your father," he said, "will want to speak with you. He will ask if you are good enough for me." "Am I?" She looked at him in the greenhouse light with the orchids around them, and the winter outside, and the warmth of a glass room full of living things a man had kept alive through 4 years of believing himself empty. "You are trying to be," she said. "That is the answer I trust most." Her father received the news in the Bridmore office, which was where all significant Gavel business was conducted, and which her father had visited with the timing of a man who had been expecting this information and had traveled from Manchester to receive it in person. "The Duke of Caverley," he said. "Yes, the man who told you he had nothing left. The man who has 37 orchids and a cracked pot and a coastal road he rebuilt with his bare hands and a set of harbor figures he memorized because a woman he had known for 2 months was being insulted at a dinner party." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "Is he good enough for you?" "He is trying to be," she said. "I gave him the same answer I am giving you, because it is the only honest one." Her father nodded. He opened his case and took out the Manchester accounts and began reviewing them, which was his way of saying that the conversation was finished and the decision was hers, and had been hers since she was 19, and he had never once regretted letting it be so. Mrs. Ashworth called at the Bridmore office on Friday with the energy of a woman who had been restraining herself since Wednesday and had reached her limit. "The greenhouse," she said, before she was fully seated. "The greenhouse," Allawan confirmed. "He has not let anyone into that greenhouse in 4 years. He once turned away the head gardener for attempting to water the orchids without permission. I am aware of the significance. You are aware of everything, which is what makes you suited to him and infuriating to everyone else." Mrs. Ashworth accepted her tea. "He is happy. I visited yesterday. He was in the morning room and the curtains were open. All of them. For the first time since Nella died, every curtain in that room was open." Allawan thought about the morning room in September, the heavy curtains pulled 3/4 closed, the room operating on reduced light, like a man operating on reduced life. "And the watercolor?" she asked. Mrs. Ashworth looked at her. "You noticed the watercolor?" "In September. It was turned at an angle, only visible from one chair." "It is facing the room now," Mrs. Ashworth said quietly. "He has turned it to face the room." Allawan held her cup and thought about a small watercolor in a silver frame, facing outward for the first time in 4 years, and about what it meant when a man who had kept his grief at an angle decided to let the room see it. "Sir Reland," Mrs. Ashworth said, "will be invited to the engagement dinner, because it is better to have him at the table than elsewhere, and because the sight of Reland Holt congratulating you on your engagement will sustain me through the remainder of the winter." "You are enjoying this," Allawan said. "I am enjoying this immensely," Mrs. Ashworth said. "Nella would have enjoyed it even more. She had a particular appreciation for the sight of Reland Holt being wrong." Allawan looked at her. It was the first time anyone had mentioned Nella in connection with approval rather than in opposition to Allawan's presence. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has been offered without conditions. "Tell me about her," Allawan said. Mrs. Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down her cup and talked about Nella Caverley for 40 minutes, and Allawan listened with the same attention she brought to everything that mattered and did not take notes and remembered every word. They were married in March at the stone church on the hill between Caverley Hall and Bridmore, which was geographically between both lives and architecturally beautiful, and had a window above the altar that caught the morning light in a way that Allawan had noticed in January, during a Sunday service she had attended, for reasons she described as spiritual, and Mrs. Ashworth described as reconnaissance. She wore the winter sea dress, not the same one, a new one, the same dark blue with gray in it, cut by someone in London who understood that when a woman chooses a color twice, it is not repetition, but declaration. She wore her mother's pearl ring and her father's expression, the one that said, "This is a decision, and I am making it with my whole attention." Dorset turned out. 38 guests in the church, the full county, and several additions from Manchester, including 2 of her father's captains, who had sailed specifically for the occasion. Sir Reland Holt was in the 4th row, wearing the expression of a man who had accepted, because declining would have been more conspicuous than attending. Her father walked her up the aisle. He walked the way he walked everything, steadily and without performance. And when they reached the front of the church, he looked at Hadwin with the direct assessment of a man who had been evaluating people and ventures for 30 years. Hadwin met his gaze. He stood with his hands at his sides, the same rough, careful hands that grew orchids and rebuilt walls, and he looked at Corwin Gavell with the steadiness of a man who had spent 4 months becoming sufficient. Her father nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that contained an entire conversation. Then he placed Allowin's hand in Hadwin's and stepped back, and the ceremony began. She had thought about this moment with precision, and the kind of detailed attention that other people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was, in fact, the opposite. She had thought about all the versions of the touch, the first, in September, in the study. Her hand on his, brief and deliberate, across a desk. You are mistaken about what you have left. A reading, a diagnosis. The touch of a woman who saw something no one else had looked for. The second, in December, at the Colborne dinner. Her hand on the back of his chair. 2 seconds, where his hand had been. I was here. I noticed. The touch of a woman leaving evidence. The third, in December, in her office above the harbor. Both hands around his one, the rough knuckles and the warmth. I am taking this. I intend to keep it. The touch of a woman who had decided. The fourth, she had decided, would not be her hand on his. It would not be a reading or evidence or a decision. It would be something else entirely. The ceremony proceeded. The vows were said. The church held them the way stone churches held things, with patience and without judgment, and the window above the altar did exactly what the morning light required of it, and Allowin stood beside a man twice her age, with rough hands and a greenhouse full of orchids, and a grief he had learned to carry rather than cure. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something is not replaced, but continued. The ceremony was complete. The church waited for whatever came next. Allowin turned to Hadwin. He turned to her. He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression, the one that had no stone in it, and no policy, and no managed distance. The one that had first appeared in October at a harbor wall and had been growing since, steadily, the way orchids grew, slowly, and with a daily attention, and in the particular light. She lifted both hands. She placed them on his face. Not his hand. His face. Both palms against his jaw, her thumbs at his cheekbones, her fingers in the gray at his temples. She held his face the way you hold something you have been looking at from a distance and can finally, after months of reading and interpreting and cataloging, simply touch. He closed his eyes. She felt the breath leave him, the long, held 4-year breath of a man who had been standing very still since Nella died. She felt it go out of him under her hands, and what replaced it was not emptiness. It was room. It was the space that opens when you stop holding everything in place and allow someone else to hold you instead. She looked at him with his eyes closed and her hands on his face in the church on the hill between both their lives. And she thought about the stone duke and the gentleman and the difference between what a county sees and what a woman sees when she looks at a man's hands instead of his title. "There you are," she said, quietly, just for him. He opened his eyes. He saw her. Not the fortune and the youth and the 23 years. Her. The woman who had touched his hand and said, "You are mistaken." The woman who had rebuilt his road and placed her hand on his chair and waited for him to become the man she had already seen. "There you are," he said back. He kissed her. The church saw it. Dorset saw it. Sir Reland managed, with some effort, to maintain the expression of a man who was pleased. Mrs. Ashworth did not manage her expression at all, and did not try to. Her father looked at the window above the altar, where the light was doing precisely what March light did in Dorset churches, which was to be so exactly itself that there was nothing to add. They walked out of the church together. He held her hand, the grip she knew, firm and rough and meant. The Dorset morning was clear and cold, and the harbor was visible from the churchyard, and Caverley Hall was visible from the other side, and between them was the coastal road they had rebuilt together in November, running along the cliff in the pale spring light. Her father found her in the garden at Caverley Hall during the wedding breakfast, in the late afternoon when the light was turning gold, and the day was reaching the hour where things that had been public became private. "Well," he said. She looked at the garden. She looked at the greenhouse, visible beyond the south wall, glass and light and 37 orchids. She looked at the house where the curtains were open, and the watercolor faced the room. "He's happy," she said. "Are you?" She thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. "I am," she said. "I am also aware that I have married a man who describes proposals as preliminary statements and keeps orchids in cracked pots, and has been calling himself empty for 4 years, while maintaining the most meticulously tended greenhouse in Dorset." "That is not a contradiction," her father said. "No," she said. "It is the whole point." He looked at her with the expression he had carried for 23 years, the one that saw everything and judged nothing, and had decided when she was very young that this particular person was going to be extraordinary, and had simply waited for the evidence to confirm it. "You saw something in him," her father said, "that the rest of the county missed." "I saw his hands," she said. Everyone else was looking at his face. Her father nodded. He looked at the greenhouse, then at the Dorset coast beyond it, the sea and the harbor, and the shipping office where his daughter had built something real while pretending it was only business. "The best partnerships," he said, "are the ones where you understand what you have been given better after the agreement than before." She looked at the greenhouse and thought about cracked pots and rough hands and a man who had believed himself empty and had been, instead, the most gently occupied person she had ever met. She understood what she had been given. She had understood it since September, in a study with an orchid on the windowsill and a hand that moved toward a living thing the moment he said a name he loved. She had simply waited for him to understand it, too. The March evening settled over Caverley Hall, warm for the season and unhurried, and the greenhouse caught the last of the light the way glass catches things, completely and without holding on, and inside it, 37 orchids continued their slow, patient, daily work of being alive, which was, Elowen thought, the most precise description of love she had ever encountered, and the only one she trusted.